BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. This episode of Black Box Online Radio is brought to you by Rep Sports and Raze Energy. Are you a fan of energy drinks, protein shakes, and health foods? Well, I sure am. I use the stuff almost every single day. They sell Raze Energy products at my local gym, but you can have them shipped to your home. Use the coupon code NED075, that's NED075, for discounts applied at the checkout. The link is in the description box. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, and on Wednesdays this year, I've been doing a regular segment about the Texarkana Moonlight murders from 1946, which was committed by a perpetrator simply known as the Phantom Killer. However, I would like to drop a couple of quick announcements before we begin, more like reminders that you can always like and subscribe to the channel if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, and you can download this program for free at LaunchPad 1. There's a link to that in the description box. That is the podcast version of the show. And there was always the BuyMeACoffee.com page, which allows you to donate or contribute to help support all of these efforts. And everything will be put back into the show, and anyone who makes a contribution will get a shout-out on Monday. And every Monday is Zodiac Mondays, where I talk about the Zodiac Killer here on BBOR. So, with the Phantom Killer, last week I did an episode talking about the first attack that took place, and as you'll see that this is going to be more or less a part 2, but if you haven't heard last week's episode, that's fine. You can keep listening. I always want these multi-part discussions to be available as part of a series, or people can just jump into them as standalone episodes. But I think that we grow up often hearing about Jack the Ripper, hearing about the Zodiac Killer, and I think a lot of us have heard stories about the Axeman of New Orleans, but I only learned about the Texarkana Moonlight murders 3 years ago, and I definitely do not believe that this is as widely discussed or even widely famous as some of the other true crime cases which I just stated. But who was the Phantom Killer? To give us a very brief introduction, I actually found something called the Encyclopedia of Arkansas.net. Absolutely wonderful. I love it. And it says, Texarkana Moonlight Murders. An unidentified assailant, often known as the Texarkana Phantom Killer, or simply the Phantom Killer, committed a number of murders and assaults in Texarkana, in Miller County, Arkansas, and Bowie County, Texas, through the spring of 1946. 5 people were killed and 3 were wounded. While there was one major suspect, he was never convicted of these crimes. The attacks serve partially as the basis for a motion picture called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. On February 22, 1946, 2 young people, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Laree, were parked on a secluded Bowie County road outside of Texarkana. They were forced out of the car by an armed man, and his face was hidden by a burlap sack with 2 slits for the eyes. The assailant beat Hollis with the gun, cracking the young man's skull in 2 places. He then sexually assaulted Laree before fleeing when he saw the headlights of a car approaching. Both of these victims eventually recovered from their wounds. That is a summary of the first attack, and there's some points that I would like to throw out in here just from previous episodes of Black Box Online Radio. There is a prime suspect in the case, they say. His name is Yule Swinney, but there is also a second suspect who is highly regarded as a likely suspect in these killings, and his name is H.B. Tennyson. Sometimes he is simply referred to as Duty Tennyson, which is his nickname. And there's another suspect that is a little bit lower on the totem pole, but I'll still share some things about him in a second. And I have to confess, he is a nameless suspect, but it is true that neither Swinney nor Tennyson were convicted of these crimes. This is an unsolved murder mystery. And the next detail that I would look at in this encyclopedia article is they say that the killer was wearing a burlap sack over his head and he cut slits for the eyes. In most of the other sources, they say that this hooded serial killer was wearing something that looked a little bit more similar to a pillowcase rather than a burlap sack, but those are just small details. Now, the second attack. 1 month later, on March 24th, two more young people were attacked. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found on another Bowie County back road, both shot in the back of the head with a .32 caliber revolver. Blood stains on the ground indicated that they had been killed outside the car and then put back in it. So big thank you to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas for that. However, I think that we are going to need a little bit more of a substantial introduction, but I would like to point out that both victims did indeed survive the first attack, as you heard there, and the perpetrator isn't necessarily trying to go for some type of vicious overkill, unleashing all of his secret hidden rage. Instead, the perpetrator almost seemed a little bit nervous about the way in which he was going after the first attack, not even shooting the victim, but striking him with the gun. And I said that that could possibly suggest some type of familiar connection, because crimes that are done with direct force, where the perpetrator is actually initiating the force on the victim, can possibly suggest a familiar connection. And this was even mentioned in the Wikipedia article on the Texarkana Moonlight murders, that there's a commonly held belief that both the victims of the first attack knew who had attacked them, but they were covering for him for some unknown reason. Now, I'm not saying anything about that, because I certainly don't know, but it definitely does seem a little bit familiar, and we should also add a little bit of clarity. Many serial killers use blunt force trauma. Ted Bundy did all the time, or how about Arthur Bomar, the Stone Cold Killer? But I think that definitely when it comes to stabbing, that suggests a more familiar connection. Blunt force trauma is often, well, it can be done by people like, say, for example, the M25 rapist, who would just find whatever weapon was nearby. And some people might do this out of instinct because they don't want to carry any type of weapon with them that is going to be traced back to them. They're just going to find something, commit the crime, and then walk away. And I don't even know how calculating it is, but it is a particularly instinctive thing to do. With the Phantom Killer, I'm seeing everything to the contrary. That this person is very cold, methodical, calculating, that the attacks are a little bit sloppy. The attacks are not exactly done in a way that covers the killer's tracks, but rather he is trying to commit the crimes and get away, but he's leaving all of the evidence behind. He's not trying to abduct the victims. He is not trying to destroy anything on the victims' bodies. Like, say, for example, with the Domingos Edwards murders from 1963, somebody murdered Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards and then dragged their bodies to a seaside shack and tried to set it on fire to burn the whole crime scene to the ground, literally. With the Phantom Killer in 1946, I'm not seeing those particular types of details. But I would like to even just go and look at the basic Wikipedia entry, because I think that's also a more substantial introduction. Richard L. Griffin, age 29, and his girlfriend of 6 weeks, Polly Ann Moore, age 17, were found dead in Griffin's car on the morning of Sunday, March 24th of 1946 by a passing motorist. The motorist saw the parked car on a lover's lane 100 yards or 91 meters south of Highway 67 in Texas. The motorist at first thought that they were asleep. Griffin was found between the seats on his knees, and his head was resting with crossed hands, and his pockets had been turned inside out. Moore was sprawled face down in the back seat. This is evidence that suggests that she was placed there after being killed on a blanket outside of the car. Now, immediately, I'm sure some of you guys are probably going to be asking the question, why would a killer do this? Was it just to buy time or something, in case some type of motorist was driving by and saw the car and saw somebody walking away? They wouldn't think anything of it, or they wouldn't have cause to stop. Whereas if they saw two bodies on the side of the road, immediately any passing motorist would have stopped, and then there would have been an additional confrontation. Was that just it, trying to buy time so that the perpetrator could get away? Or what do you make of this detail that the male victim's pockets were turned inside and out? Was somebody trying to rob them? Was somebody trying to stage the scene as a robbery? And was this person the phantom killer just trying to hide his entire identity? Because I talked about the Zodiac, Jack the Ripper, the New Orleans Axeman, and now the Phantom Killer, but all three of those cases, the Axeman, the Zodiac, and Jack the Ripper, have somebody writing taunting or threatening letters. And I think that the Zodiac Killer would be the biggest example of those, but I don't mean to go off on a giant spiel about that. The Phantom Killer doesn't seem to be a taunting serial killer as much as someone who is trying to either get revenge on society or someone who is trying to inflict damage on other people, making other people suffer, someone who maybe had some type of calculating reason for committing these crimes. And I talked about a possible one in the last episode, that Jack the Ripper operated in the summer and the fall, and the Phantom Killer operates in the winter and the spring, and it's almost like coming full circle. And if only there were a serial killer that had a circle divided into 4 sections, that would have taken the predecessor's work and gone a step further in his own mind, if you can imagine that. But there's also something here that says, no extant reports indicate that either Griffin or Moore was examined by a pathologist. Contemporaneous local rumors said that Moore had been sexually assaulted, but modern reports refute this claim. And I think this is important because the victim in the first attack, the female victim, that is, Raze, she was sexually assaulted, but that's why there was, that seems to be the focus on the killer's mind there, as opposed to murdering the two of them. But if you want to talk about some type of psychological profiling or just a whole bunch of YouTube speculation, I think, in my own unprofessional way, that this definitely shows a serial killer, one person who is growing in confidence and becoming more and more carefree, less neurotic. Those types of behaviors are being expressed by this person, because in the first attack, there may have been some type of familiar connection, and then instead of shooting the victims, maybe the person just didn't have it in them to pull the trigger, or maybe they did and they wanted to beat the person with a gun anyway. I really don't know what the person was thinking, but if you're going to make some type of educated guess, I would say that the perpetrator in the second attack really didn't seem to hold back too much, and the victims were shot, the bodies were relocated, and I think that that stems in from someone who is becoming less neurotic, but not absolute zero, because, once again, trying to hide the victims, at least the naked eye. And can I just ask you that as a challenge question? Hypothetically, if that were true, why did the killer murder the victims outside of the car and then move their bodies back in? And secondarily, why would the male victim's pockets be turned inside out? And I said 2 possibilities. It was a robbery, or it was staged to look like a robbery to confuse the authorities, but you can weigh in the comments section down below. And I would now like to give a shout out to the YouTube channel Most Notorious, which anybody can listen to. It is a podcast mostly, but it is available here on YouTube. I listen to this show all the time when I want to learn more about true crime cases, and I recently heard their interview with James Presley, who has a book out about the Texarkana Moonlight murders, and he brought up some very interesting points about the time frame, because there are the Texarkana Moonlight murders of 1946, right? What does that mean? It is one of the first major homicide sprees in America in the post-World War II era. And that is very important for two possibilities. Forget prime suspect Yul Swinney, forget Duty Tennyson. What about the third possible suspect? And that is the German prisoner of war. And I don't even have a name for this person yet, but maybe we will find one throughout the course of this series. This is only episode number 2, but it is something that I've always been meaning to get back to, because when I was talking about the Texarkana Moonlight murders back in 2019, I would go on and on about Yul Swinney, I would go on and on about Duty Tennyson, but the third suspect that I think has given somewhat of a recognized form of credibility is the German prisoner of war, and was simply going out, trying to wreak havoc on society, trying to conceal his identity, wearing something that is an extremely makeshift costume. And I think that there could be a certain case for that, as well as people having trouble describing the killer's voice. But here is another point that was mentioned by James Presley in the Most Notorious interview. What else would you have, absolutely, no matter what, in the post-World War II era? People who were dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And he didn't say these words exactly, but I totally comprehended the point about how people come back from the war and they're not the same. And could this have been committed by somebody who was dealing with PTSD or some type of mental instability that got provoked because of experiences in World War II? I mean, 1946. I mean, 1 year after 1945, right? So I don't think that that's beyond belief, and I would definitely put those types of observations into the category of something that deserves serious consideration. Because even if it turns out that, okay, it wasn't a World War II fighter who had some mental instability issues and post-traumatic stress disorder, I still think that it is worthy of consideration. But there's also a final point that James Presley shared in his interview on Most Notorious that I thought was valuable, and that is that Texarkana might seem like a small town. It might seem like a place that people only mention here and there, mentioned infrequently. But Texarkana was the largest place for industrious life, a largest place for business between Dallas and Shreveport, Louisiana. And there's a third city that gets factored into that, and that, of course, is Little Rock, Arkansas. So you have these three cities around it: Shreveport, Louisiana, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Dallas, Texas, and it just becomes more or less a crossroads, or a place that is very important for business strategy. So that means that you have all types of people coming in and out of Texarkana, and one of the leading theories in all of those unsolved crimes that I talked about with the spree killers, such as Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac, the Phantom Killer, the Axeman of New Orleans, about why the infrequency of these murders, and could it possibly be that somebody was just stationed there for a brief period of time? I mean, the Phantom Killer is operating from February of 1946 to May of 1946. Why such a brief period of time? This is a 10-week time frame. When you read about serial killers such as the Golden State Killer operating for, let's see, how many years was that? 12 years, maybe 13 years. It's actually possible that the Golden State Killer committed his first crime in 1973. A lot of people think it was in 1974, and then the murders went on to 1986. But also you have maybe a serial killer like John Wayne Gacy going after 33 young males. With the Phantom Killer, he is only murdering 5 people in this crime spree. 3 other people would be injured. But I think that it's so important to consider that geography could have played a role in this. And it doesn't only have to be somebody who is stationed in Texarkana for business reasons. How about being stationed there because of something military related, or somebody who is only in the country for a brief time? And this is unrelated to the Moonlight murders, but it's just talking about how people can cross borders internationally, how true crime theories can formulate. Back when I did the series on the New Orleans Axeman, one guy on YouTube was sharing his theory about it, and that was that there was another German citizen And yes, this is even prior to World War I, so we had lots of German immigration in America. And he believed that this guy from Germany came to America around the age of 20 or so, maybe 18, 19, 20 years old, and he committed the four murders in 1879, murdering a husband and wife. That he also committed crimes in both Germany and the United States, and they just went on and on and on all the way into, of course, the Axeman murders in 1918 and 19, and then maybe even some of the other homicides in surrounding places, and that over a 60-year time span, it was all just this one person who is committing an enormous amount of serial killer homicides, and he did it just by moving from place to place to evade capture. Theorists have these claims all the time. That's their explanation about how their suspect was able to commit so many murders and not get caught. Well, he was always moving around, and by the time they're investigating the crime scenes, he's already moved on to another town. With the Phantom Killer, to get back on this basis, it appears that there are several reasons why people would think that the Phantom Killer moved to a different town, and that is because the infrequency of the crimes, just disappearing, vanishing into thin air, just a reason maybe why the crimes would just stop without an extremely clear motive, because I found that when I'm reading up on the Phantom Killer, almost everybody seems to say that the motive for his crimes appears to be baseless, they're meaningless. In fact, they just seem like a series of motiveless crimes. But to help us out, I'm going to go over to the website ranker.com and look at their section Unspeakable Crimes, talking about the unsolved mystery of the Texarkana Moonlight murders, and this one is written by Rachel Sowerby, just citing the source. The Texarkana Moonlight murders were some of the most mysterious unsolved crimes in Texas. The story of the town that dreaded sundown became a horror movie hit in the 1970s. But what really happened to the people in Texarkana in 1946? Texas's Phantom Slayer kept the tiny town of Texarkana, located on the border of Texas and Arkansas, paralyzed with fear for months. Four separate attacks occurred, resulting in 5 deaths and 3 near-fatal assaults. All of those who encountered the Phantom were couples, or at least appeared to be. They were gunned down and shot on rural lovers' lanes, with the final couple shot in their own home. I cannot stress this enough. How similar is that to the Zodiac Killer? The Phantom Killer is going after couples who are parked in cars on lovers' lanes, and then deviates from the pattern with the final crime. The Zodiac Killer, of course, murdered Paul Stine on October 11th of 1969, and then this was the murder of Virgil Starks, I believe, the final confirmed victim of the Phantom Killer. Back to the article. The fear was intense, the killer was terrifying, and the town couldn't see when it was all going to stop. The Texarkana murders left a deep scar on the psyche of the little town and remain one of Texas's most notorious unsolved crimes. The Phantom Slayer successfully killed 5 of his 8 victims. The Phantom Killer was initially credited with attacks on 8 people. 5 of them were killed: Betty Jo Booker, Paul Martin, Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, and Virgil Starks. Here's one note, though, about Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, about whether or not they were targeted, or perhaps they were just random victims who were parked in a car doing some Lover's Lane activities. And I would go back to the Most Notorious episode with James Presley, and he shared a detail about them, and that was that they were both leaving relationships from other people, that they perhaps were both still committed to other people, but they were in the process of leaving the relationships. So does that also suggest some type of familiar connection? I certainly don't think the Phantom Killer was a disgruntled lover who was in relationships with all of the victims or had some type of personal connection to all of the victims. I don't know how the evidence would suggest that, but it seems like everybody has some type of very personal connection to this killer, whether it's being attacked and being struck with the gun using force during the first attempted murder, and this one, again, just something about that really just kind of puts me off the radar, that they were both trying to trying to leave other relationships. Now, it could be that all of the victims were pre-chosen and they weren't random victims, and this person isn't only trying to get revenge on society the way that certain serial killers and mass shooters do. Instead, this person may have just known them from social circles and taken a certain disliking to them. So many things are possible, and you can always share your idea in the comment section down below. Do these seem like personal killings, or do they seem like random victims? Like, the crimes are premeditated, but the victims have not been pre-chosen, and this person simply wants to commit murders and doesn't necessarily care who they are as long as he is committing murders. The three who survived and lived through the harrowing experiences were Virgil Stark's wife Katie, who was shot in the face twice but managed to get help, and the first couple who managed to survive the attack, Hollis and LaRae, who both got away but not unharmed. Yeah, absolutely. Hollis was struck in the head multiple times, and as you heard, he had multiple fractures in his skull. The killer targeted couples with their pairs primarily attacked on lovers' lanes. The attacks began on February 22nd of 1946. The first couple, Hollis and LaRae, had gone to see a movie, but before heading down a known lovers' lane just outside of town, it was there that they were attacked by the Phantom Killer. Griffin and Moore were found dead on a lovers' lane near the town about a month later. A very big time frame for somebody who only had about 2 months of activity. I mean, we're talking the end of February to the beginning of May. That really is only about 2 months, 2 months and some odd days. And this perpetrator is waiting a month from the first attack on Hollis and LaRae to the attack on Griffin and Moore. That is, again, not completely abnormal, because I have to go back to the Zodiac killer case. The Zodiac waited 7 months from attacking David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen at Lake Herman Road to attacking the couple on the 4th of July, Mike Mageau and Darlene Ferrin. So I just have to restate that. Does this not suggest that this is one person, the same killer, no wacky, twisted conspiracy theory, one killer who is growing in confidence, realized that the first effort was completely botched, and he was trying to find it in himself to correct all of these mistakes that he made? And it sounds so terrible talking about it that way. He was murdering people, absolutely sickening, and rest in peace to all of the victims. But again, so far, I'm really just seeing one single killer who is cold, methodical, and calculating, who is premeditated, but maybe doesn't have the best anticipation and decision-making skills. Murder appears to be the primary motive for the Phantom Killer. It really doesn't appear like he is getting any type of monetary gain out of this. It doesn't appear that he is getting anything other than thrill killing, than murdering people to fuel his own excitement. It could possibly be some type of revenge killing, but I think that is so uncertain now, it's really difficult to make the determination. The killer wore a white mask with holes cut out for the eyes and a mouth. Because the Phantom Killer's first two victims, Hollis and LaRae, survived the attack, they were able to provide a vague description. Unfortunately, it was very vague. When the Phantom approached their vehicle, he shined a light inside, blinding them and preventing them from seeing his face. Now, I have to go back to the Zodiac Killer. Mike Mageau survived the Zodiac's attack at Blue Rock Springs Park and said that exact same thing. He couldn't see the details of the killer's face because he had a flashlight blinding him in the eye, but he did say it was a large flashlight, and it was one that you had to carry with a handle. But the Zodiac Killer told us himself that he taped a pencil flashlight to the gun barrel at the Lake Herman Road murders, so he is doing this exact same thing, approaching a parked car at a lover's lane with a flashlight. When the Phantom approached their vehicles, he shined a flashlight inside, blinding them and preventing them from seeing his face. Throughout the attack, Hollis and LaRae were still able to catch some glimpses of him, and this is where their discrepancies between the descriptions take place. Hollis thought the Phantom was a young white male, while LaRae believed that he may have been a light-skinned black man, but one thing was consistent. They both said that the man was wearing a white hood over his eyes, with holes cut out, and one for the mouth as well. So I think that, with the second attack on the next two victims, it is definitely more difficult to learn how it happened because there are no surviving witnesses, and I would expect that the killer was still wearing his hood. I would expect that the killer was still trying to fight the victims in a very confrontational way. This would be a difference between the Zodiac and the Phantom Killer, and I think that would be that the Phantom is way more physical, way more confrontational. The Phantom Killer is practically brawling with some of the victims, or maybe scrapping, or perhaps just roughing them up, and one of the victims was sexually assaulted. The Phantom definitely seems like there's almost some types of twisted creativity involved with the way that the Phantom is assaulting some of the victims, and I'll discuss that in a later episode if you'd like to see a reenactment of that. There's a scene in The Town That Dreaded Sundown where the Phantom Killer murders one of the victims with a trombone and some blades, and I mean, it's in terms of horror cinema, it's great. In terms of of real life activity, thinking that there was a Phantom Killer who went around targeting people, that is not great in any way. Maybe a great disappointment in humanity, but that's about it. But I would also like to leave you with another challenge question. I used to do the Versus series on this channel, where I would simply talk about two different serial killers, and I would compare and contrast their psychological profiles, done in my own unprofessional way. Let's look at the details of this case, and let's look at the details of that case. Would you like to hear that about the Phantom Killer? Would you like to hear about the Phantom Killer versus the Zodiac Killer in a psychological breakdown, as well as the Phantom versus Jack the Ripper, and maybe even the Long Island serial killer? Because the Long Island serial killer is so different than the Phantom. That is a typical serial killer operating from 1996 to 2010, maybe 10 to 16 victims. That's what most serial killers do. They don't kill super frequently, but they still commit murders over a very long time span, 14 years in that example. But with the Phantom Killer, 10 weeks, 10 weeks in the states of Arkansas and Texas. That is so different. And this isn't somebody like the Long Island serial killer who's going after primarily prostitutes, primarily single lone females. This is somebody who is going after couples who are parked in cars. Again, I have to suggest that sounds like some type of rejected lover who, by rejected lover, I mean some guy who was perhaps not even a lover at all. I was recently talking about involuntary celibates or incels on this channel. There's some signs that the Phantom Killer may have been in that way, someone who was just completely sexually rejected from his peers, and I can only guess at that point, or there could be something completely different. But what do you think about any of those observations? And I really would like to know your answers to the challenge questions. Why would the killer murder the victims outside of the car and then put their bodies back in? Why would the killer turn inside out the pockets of one of the victims? And of course, you could weigh in about what types of future episodes you would like to hear about on Black Box Online Radio. Anybody can write this show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram, and I will see you over there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.